Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beyond Stocks and Bonds, brought to you by Convi, the fractional investment platform for alternative assets like art, fossils, and real estate. My name is Ioana, and on this podcast, we bring on leading alternative investment managers to discuss the latest trends in alternative investment. Please note that the content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Investing in alternative assets involves risks, including potential loss of invested capital. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Peter Lovisek, the founder of Fossil Realm, one of the most prominent rare natural history specimen suppliers worldwide. I am particularly excited about this episode because fossil investments are starting to get a lot of attention from investors in general. And it's a niche asset class with very little information available. We'll discuss investments in natural history specimens and cover the future of this asset class as it becomes more established within the alternative investment space. With an impressive historical performance of 35% per annum, Fossil Realm has specialized in curating investment grade natural specimens for its clients. Peter operates in a very interesting niche, utilizing his decades of experience in paleontology within the investment space. Peter, hello. You're very welcome.
So glad to be here.
Great. So, Peter, could you start telling our listeners what sparked your interest in fossils and natural history in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a family that was completely immersed in natural science. In fact, my father was a research scientist who worked at the Royal Ontario Museum. My mother also worked at the Royal Ontario Museum as in public relations, and that's where they met. They later founded a science and nature camp called the Toronto Nature Center, and they're also just extremely involved in taking us on field trips and going to museums and real world experience to understand the beauty and intricacy of nature.
Must be an interesting hobby to be part of as a child.
Extremely interesting as a child, having a father who actually worked with live animals in the film business as well. I had experience to holding and seeing all sorts of amazing creatures, including reptiles and amphibians and insects. So it's not just prehistoric animals, but modern day animals and nature that interest me as well.
Wow, yeah, I can imagine. I would have loved that as a child for sure.
Yeah, and lots of fun.
Yeah. So, of course, now I can completely imagine why it became interesting for you as an adult that you had this access to the industry from very early on, which many people don't. So, definitely very lucky in that sense. But may I ask, how did the idea for Fossil Realm came about?
Yeah, so not only did my parents run the Toronto Nature Center, they also had, as a camp, they also had a store. It originally started as a gift shop. It then grew into a full time store in Midtown Toronto. And so I also was involved with the store, including not just retail sales, but the sourcing of items in places like the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show. There was a show in Detroit as well. And even as a teenager, I attended these shows. I bought my own fossils as early as 14, 15 in order to resell. So I was doing this, basically from being a kid practically. So
Ah, really cool. Do you still have the fossils that some of the fossils that you found?
yeah, I sold them. Yeah. So I mean, I think even as a teenager, I focused on the higher end even then as much as my budget could accommodate. So one of the first premium items I sold was a cave bear skull. Uh,
Oh,
that was sold on eBay actually.
how have you made the profit?
Yeah, I made $1,000.
That's a very good budget for a teenager.
I remember specifically it cost me 1,400, which was of course I had to save up that amount of money as when I was in high school, and so it was a pretty big risk. I guess I had an
Mhm.
entrepreneurial drive then as well, and a bit of a risk taking, calculated risk. And I managed to sell it on eBay for 2,400. So I remember that as my biggest first profitable sale. And it didn't take me very long to sell it either, a matter of months.
Oh, great. And I can assume that the fee that eBay takes is probably one of the motivation factors to do it without eBay.
In fact, it actually was. I was selling on eBay in the early 2000s. And up until about 2012, I started to work on fossilrealm.com. And, we're a Shopify store essentially. And we started off in 2012 like that and continued to refine and grow and expand. And it's been quite an exciting journey.
Oh, great. I actually used to work at Shopify, so
Yeah.
I know
It's
how many
actually quite
entrepreneurs sell.
Yeah, it's quite good. It's a Canadian company too.
Yeah, 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 I know. So, can you tell us a little bit about what makes natural history specimens such an interesting investment opportunity?
There are numerous reasons why natural history specimens are an interesting and compelling investment opportunity. Uh, for one thing, they're very limited, especially the high end pieces are very limited and scarce on the market. So that's going to ensure that they maintain their value over time, as well as the fact that they are really timeless connections to outer space in the distant past. And so you're bringing in history, science, and also art, which are fixtures of human society. So as time goes on, the appeal will continue to be universal. In other words, compared to other collectible categories, perhaps fossils and meteorites are definitely not a trend. So I see the value increasing over time. I don't see major dips in the marquee fossils. It's Of course, the market is still cyclical, and there are times when you're going to see a 10 or 20% decrease, maybe even more. But over the long run, it's highly likely that certain well selected fossils and meteorites will maintain and likely increase in value.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's definitely an interesting industry, and to be fair, I think the public has shown. So on Convi, Fossil Realm was one of the most popular new launches of 2024. And I think they've shared our opinion that there's so much about this industry to learn. And also, it is clear that it will continue being interesting. It's not like more fossils will just appear. So there's always going to be less on the market.
Right, absolutely. I mean, there will be new specimens being discovered all the time. And as the market matures, there'll actually be more hunters and more established companies as well, putting significant amount of resources into finding these pieces. But at the end of the day, they are very limited. For example, one particular type of fossil, once it's completely extracted from a quarry, will never be found again. So, in that sense, certain specific types of fossils will never be created or manufactured. And in general, too, the very high end pieces are just will always be rare,
Yeah.
exceptional fossils because they just to have a highly complete skeleton, for example, is incredibly rare. So even if there's more exploration, more resources put into it, something like a T-Rex skull will definitely be rare always.
Yeah, for sure. But in terms of fossils as an investment, I do think it is a bit more difficult to understand when you're comparing it to other investments that maybe the world is more accustomed with. So, of
Mhm.
course, I'm talking about public markets, stocks, bonds. But we have been seeing not only individuals, but also institutions like pension funds that are starting to look into alternative investments. And we do know overall the alternative investment space is a great way to diversify from the public markets to reduce risk in a portfolio. So, what I wanted to ask you is what role do you think diversification plays when investing in fossils or other natural history specimens?
I mean, I think it's an amazing way to diversify a portfolio. They're essentially uncorrelated to traditional markets. Changes in currency values don't affect the value. Even during economic downturns, the market could be doing well. Of course, when the economy is booming, you'll often see records set, but that doesn't mean that they'll be dropping significantly regardless of external factors. So, in terms of diversification, they're pretty much the perfect asset.
Great. I'd say another topic that investors are looking at when it comes to investments is risks. So, of course, when it comes to stocks, you kind of know it's the metrics of a company that you're looking at. Maybe you're
Right.
looking at the future growth of revenues. What do you think are the risks when investing in rare natural history specimens? And not necessarily when it comes to you and your company, but the industry in general?
Well, for most collectors or investors, the risks are very significant if you're not working with an expert. It takes an extremely long time to develop the right connections in the industry, as well as specialized knowledge and trust. And so, if a buyer doesn't have these relationships, if they're not themselves a very sophisticated and built up collector or investor, there are risks of, in fact, purchasing fake specimens. That's not too common. Fossils, high end fossils, are not regularly forged outright. But what's more common is misrepresented items. So you might have something, a dinosaur skull that's, 20% complete. Now, if a seller is saying it's 50% complete, of course, the value is totally different.
Hmm.
It's going to be much higher. And when you work with an expert like Fossil Realm, there's a very strong vetting process that occurs. So, for example, if I see an item in person, I can use magnification, I can use UV lighting. And so I can assess a piece for restoration, for example, as well as other repair. The UV light can pick up glue, for example. It can pick up sculpting. But not only that, it's a matter of working with really trusted sources, in particular, direct sources. So if I was selling a dinosaur skull, I would know the person who dug it out of the ground. So I would know the whole history of the piece. And that's fundamental when investing in a high value natural history specimen, is really understanding the provenance and the source. So if you're not working with a trusted expert, there's a risk of buying misrepresented items, which are, of course, worth considerably less. There's also risks of overpaying, just not understanding the
Hmm.
true value of a piece, because it's very difficult to just look at, say, an auction result and interpret it. The piece might not be quite as good as the auction described, or maybe it was a bad auction and the price is lower than one would expect just because it was a poorly promoted auction. So the sort of insider knowledge is required to really understand and interpret results and to realize the value and prices of these pieces.
Yeah, also there's fees when it comes to auction.
Yeah, absolutely. But I just mean in terms of if you're trying to understand the value as a buyer, you may
Yeah,
look at auction results, and this actually happens to us as a seller. Um, a buyer might present us with certain auction results and say, look, I think the price is too high. Um, and then we have to educate them and explain the nuances of the particular piece and the market. For example, maybe it was purchased 5 or 6 years ago at the auction, the value is different. And how
yeah,
different was the value? That really requires expertise to interpret how one type of fossil was performing 5 or 6 years ago versus more recently. In some cases, the prices might have changed dramatically.
yeah, I completely agree. And that's why we work with experts such as yourself, because we wouldn't be experts into this space. It would take too much time, and we know our strengths.
Yeah, no, and that's, I think, what is great about Convi. One of the strongest aspects of Convi is partnering with genuine experts. Regardless of the asset class, these specialized industries require working with a true expert. And there aren't many in the world either, especially in our industry, people who really track and understand and analyze the market.
Also, people that are fair and
Yes. Yeah, fair and honest
want.
and transparent. Yeah.
Yeah, but we covered the area of purchasing. So
Yes.
once it's purchased, let's imagine the item is selected. Of course, it is always better to work with an expert based on your points.
Yes.
But what about holding the item and then after holding the item, selling it to
Yes.
another collector for investment purposes? Would you mind just walking us through a little bit the process? How would it happen in a situation where the customer comes with you, and what would be the risks if they didn't come?
Right. I think that one challenge is for collectors to resell an item. If they're not a dealer, it's quite difficult. So, the compared to say art, which is a more mature market, there's a lot of uncertainty and lack of trust when it comes to selling these items where people buyers might not even think it's real. So if you're a private collector without a history as a seller, you might find it difficult to resell an item. Your best bet is probably a major auction like Christie's or Sotheby's. However, that's not straightforward either because these auction houses tend to only work with trusted partners who are dealers. They will work with perhaps clients who have bought from their auctions before, but it's very challenging to resell an item for fair market value if you're a collector. And that's where the value of an item is in part related to the party selling it.
And in terms of the sales process, I understand you have various different profiles, which makes it quite interesting. Who's interested from your perspective into these type of items? Because what I didn't know. So when it comes to other asset classes on Confi, let's take
Yes.
watches. We have a formula. There's a investor and then a collector on the other end. But I understand from when it comes to fossils, you're not
Yes.
only looking at people, it's also maybe companies, or
Mhm.
there's some other business incentives when it comes to buying.
Right. I mean, I would actually break the market down into five buyer personas, the high end market in particular. This is something I've never shared before, actually. um, I haven't written about this or spoken about it publicly, but the way I see it is high end pieces have five distinct segments or personas. And the first is the art oriented buyer. So this is someone who's appreciating the visual appeal of an item and treating it as a fine art object. So its
Hmm.
visual impressiveness, its presence are extremely important. Next we have science oriented buyers, such as museums or institutions. So now we're looking at the scientific significance, and they're viewed as a scientific specimen. Then we have what I would call the hardcore collector market. And these are buyers who are private collectors, very familiar with the industry. And they're looking at the rarity of an item, how unique it is. They typically will also be mindful of the scientific significance and the visual aspect, but these are your very serious collectors. Then we have your investment buyers who are of course treating the item as an investment asset that's going to appreciate. Of course, all of these buyers appreciate the visual appeal and the science behind it, but it's to different degrees and different levels of importance. The final type of buyer is a more casual buyer who really thinks it's a cool conversation piece. As long as the piece is real, if it's really from space, if it's really 100 million years old, that's all they need to know. They still appreciate the science and the look, but this is just something they kind of want to show off. The way it works is that these five personas essentially drive the entire high end market. And the value of an item actually depends on who it's being marketed to.
Very interesting, and probably very difficult to navigate.
It actually informs our strategy of what we acquire. So, in order for a high value rare item to be liquid, it has to have a sufficiently broad appeal.
Hmm.
So if we only picked items for the science buyer, like museums, we would not be able to sell it to the casual buyer.
Yeah, interesting. So you have very different total addressable market when it comes.
Right. So we're sort of having convi items, for example, actually appeal to all of the five personas. So what we're doing is we're ensuring a certain amount of liquidity by appealing to a broader range of buyer segments. And so, for example, if we look at the palm frond, it's beautiful as a fine art object, almost like a natural painting. It's 9 feet tall. It's very large and impressive, attention grabbing. So, your art oriented buyer who cares about presentation and exhibition and sharing this piece in person, they're going to be very interested in an item like the large palm frond. Then your science oriented and museum type buyer will be interested because of how well it's preserved, incredible level of preservation, and even scientifically interesting features of the item, such as insect bite marks. And in this case, the inset bike marks are also artistic and aesthetic. So now you have a piece that's appealing to both the art oriented buyer, the science and museum oriented buyer, and of course, the hardcore collectors. Many people collect Green River Formation fossils. So this would be a marquee piece in a hardcore Green River Formation collector or a plant collector. This will be very appealing to them as well. Then we have investors. Of course, a piece that's this exceptional is bound to appreciate in value, or it has very high investment potential. And then the casual buyers are also interested in it because it's just a wow factor. You know, it's 50 million years old. It's huge and impressive. So what we're doing is we're strategically choosing pieces that have a broader appeal. This is actually Fossil Realm's approach for the items that we invest in and are part of our collection.
That was a great example. Thank you. I think it's also very relevant to all the investors into the Palm Front.
Yeah, and not surprisingly, the same thinking went into the selection of the meteorite, and pretty much every conv item is going to be knocking off all of those potential buyer segments or appealing to all of them.
Great to hear. And now that we are talking about a varied amount of artifacts,
Yes.
I'd love to hear more about different types of fossils and meteorites that
Mhm.
you're looking at sourcing in general.
Right.
Because compared to other asset classes we are looking on Convi, it's very wide. We are
Mhm.
ranging from very different types of fossils that maybe behave in very different ways to meteorites.
Right.
And we know that it's the same industry, but everything's unique in itself.
It's extremely unique. And with fossils alone, of course, what pops into most people's heads is dinosaurs and maybe ice age fossils like mammoths and saber-toothed cats. And actually, dinosaurs and mammoths and saber-toothed cats are very marketable fossils because of their iconic nature. But there are so many types of fossils. It's very rich. And they're very different in size, in appearance, in time periods, different types of organisms. So we have invertebrates, such as ammonites, which are marine mollusks, beautiful
Mhm.
coiled shells. And in some cases, they even display iridescence and multiple colors. So beautiful display pieces, unlike anything else in the world. And we also have plant fossils like the palm frond. Ferns
Mhm.
are very popular as well. Both of them are so aesthetic. They're just gorgeous. You know, we can look at reptile fossils. Flying reptiles like pterosaurs are always in demand, or marine reptiles like a
Mhm.
mosasaur, plesiosaur. Many people think they're dinosaurs, but they're actually reptiles. But really, the list is quite long, and the very rich diversity of fossils. And then, of course, you get into thousands of types of meteorites, and you get into thousands of types of minerals and crystals as well. So we have natural history is comprised, at least in terms of the commercial aspect, of these three main categories: fossils, meteorites, and minerals. And so, in terms of diversification, it's possible to be extremely diverse within natural history as an investment strategy as well.
And we are covering all these different types of assets on Convi. So we do hope that the average retail investors can also get access to all these different types of assets, diversify, and get exposure to a very, very interesting asset class.
Yeah, and it's very. I mean, that's what I love about Convi is how this is such an exclusive domain where I would say that the collectors I work with, the buyers I work with, who are doing this from a financial perspective in a serious way, we're talking about net worths of 100 million, 500 million, billions. These are really high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals and institutions. So for your everyday buyer, these are just off limits, the most exclusive pieces. Even a T Rex tooth, a single tooth, Without the root, just the crown, 3 or 4 inches long, you're getting into 20 or 30 or $40,000 now. That in itself, a single partial tooth is an exclusive piece, and the
Mhm.
majority of buyers simply can't afford a $40,000 tooth.
Yeah, and also it's not economical if you have maybe a few millions
Right.
to invest.
Right. And if you want to be able to have a more than just all your eggs in one basket and have a variety of types of natural history specimens.
So you mentioned just now the T-Rex tooth, which of course it's a known investment, very marketable. In general, you do select all these wide range of asset classes. So I wanted to ask you, what makes a natural specimen investment grade?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something I've thought of quite a bit over many years. And one of the most important features of an investment specimen is its visual appeal. Is it stunning? Is it beautiful? Is it impressive? Does it have presence? That's extremely important. But of course, there's much more than just how it looks. It has to be a very high quality specimen. And a big part of quality is how well it was excavated and prepared to ensure that the integrity of the fossil is preserved.
Mhm.
Next, it's the importance of provenance, understanding precisely where the specimen was found. If you're talking about a meteorite, that'll include the coordinates of where it landed. If you're talking about a fossil, that'll include the coordinates of where it was dug up. Now, getting into the detail of just GPS coordinates is only for very high value pieces, but in general, we need to know where it was found, what formation, what age, what locality, and we need to ensure that it was legally collected and can be legally traded. So the paperwork is very important, especially with the really high end pieces. So if you talk about a dinosaur skeleton, you want to have a quarry or dig site map. You want to have an osteological map, an osteograph, which shows which parts are real and which are restored. You might even have land leases or land deeds, records of these to ensure that it's been legally collected and we know exactly where it came
Mhm.
from, and even transfer of ownership. This level of provenance is becoming more and more important. But this is right now most applicable to very high end pieces only.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. um of course it is extremely difficult to even find the provenance when it comes to maybe a single person and not a business actually
Right.
finding this piece. So it's
Right.
interesting to hear, because I heard that before people are finding fossils in their backyards, and
Yeah. Well,
uh, that would make it difficult, I assume, for them to
so
sell.
it actually is a major difficulty in determining the provenance, and that's why we work with direct sources. So
Yeah.
with a really high value item, even something like a T-Rex tooth, I'll typically know the artisanal digger or commercial paleontologist who unearthed it.
Hmm.
And I'll actually be able to see what it looks like right when it came out of the ground. So then I know with certainty what it is someone is buying.
Yeah.
And I know with certainty that it's authentic if I essentially saw it come out of the ground and bought it from that supplier. So this is one way to ensure to vet an item. But of course, there are other items that are historical specimens and even traded. Maybe it was unearthed 60 years ago. Now that's where it gets a little bit tricky, right? So we don't
Yeah.
know. It passed multiple hands over the 60 years. Maybe it was in a local museum. Maybe it was then owned by a collector. Maybe it was then at an auction. Maybe. And the truth is, with many natural history specimens, this full chain of provenance is simply unknown.
Hmm.
This is where expertise comes in. And but when it comes to really valuable pieces, I would say once you get into 6 and 7 figure pieces and above, you really need to have a certain amount of paperwork and understanding of provenance. Otherwise, the value of the piece, the resale value drops dramatically.
Yeah, completely understand. And I wanted to add a small note. So we do have we'll have a new collaboration with the fossil realm that is opening up very soon. It will be an ammonite fossil.
Yes.
So if you want to get access to the fossil investment space from as little as 250 euro, and invest into a piece with provenance authenticated and so on, you can check it out on the Convi app. That is KONVI app. To continue on the topic of market trends,
Mhm.
what do you believe are the main challenges and opportunities in the market of natural specimens today?
The challenge of understanding the legal provenance of a piece is very major, and it's becoming more and more important. But at the same time, when you do have the opportunity to buy a high quality, visually appealing piece with proper, solid provenance, that's the type of piece that's going to retain value and likely appreciate. So, understanding the importance of these features, especially provenance now, is a major direction of the industry. So, if you're able to invest in or acquire a specimen with solid provenance, especially if it's a dinosaur
Mhm,
fossil. It's very particular to dinosaur fossils at the moment. However, all types of high end fossils, including ammonites, like the iridescent ammonites from Calgary, it's very important to have detailed provenance. And whether it's in the form of a certificate or a letter of provenance, it is an opportunity if you start investing in those pieces now, because as the market matures, those are the only types of pieces that are actually going to be traded. A piece without proper provenance is it's not going to be worth nothing, but it's going to be worth dramatically less and much harder to sell, especially if you're not an established seller. So if you're a
mhm.
private collector investing in a piece without solid provenance, even now it would be difficult to sell for a high price. I think 20, 30 years from now, it would be almost impossible. That chain of provenance and understanding the origin and the specifics of an item, that is going to be fundamental.
Yeah, completely agree. And now that we are talking about the museum pieces, so even the meteorite you
Yeah,
mentioned from the start, it is a museum piece, one in a thousand meteorites.
absolutely.
I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on selling museum grade pieces on the private markets? I mean, of course, we know the art is very established and we see the same movements in the art space, but what do you think is the sentiment in the natural history specimen space?
I mean, it's actually very important to realize that many museums are not interested in acquiring the types of pieces that are on the market. Now, there are exceptions, but museums often, when it comes to exhibitions and displays, they're already full. So, unless it's a new museum, they might not be interested in a piece for display if if they already have a similar piece, or it just might not fit the theme or exhibitions
Mhm.
that they're having. And then in terms of for research, very few pieces are of extreme scientific significance. So, for example, a balanced approach is to think that if an item is a new species or has an incredibly rare feature, something very informative to the scientific community, a piece like that should be studied and placed in a museum or academic institution. That should be a priority. But even items that are rare on the market are not necessarily of extreme scientific interest.
Mhm.
That being said, with the meteorite that was sourced for Convi, it's already been analyzed and classified. And so now basically a small piece of it was cut off and sent to a scientist, and they analyzed it in a lab. And so this information is then eventually published in something called the Meteoritical Bulletin,
Mm.
which is essentially an encyclopedia or Bible of all meteorites, including their type and their composition, when they fell, who actually bought and sold it at the very outset. So with meteorites, the scientific community has access to all of the information about them. So the Convi meteorite has been studied. So it's not being lost to science, for example, which is one of the arguments you hear sometimes.
I didn't know that.
with meteorites, we typically deal only in meteorites that have been analyzed. And for one thing, that includes that acts in some way as a form of authenticity and or third party validation.
Yeah.
And not only that, it's of course it's more interesting when we know exactly what type of meteorite it is. Some meteorites are more common and you can just look at them and get a good sense of what they are. Sometimes you actually need to cut into them, examine the interior, and use specialized equipment to really understand the composition. And so, with meteorites, the types of pieces we're dealing with are all classified already and known to science. And so, it's in a sense, it's a form of collaborating. The meteorite community and the classification scientists and the commercial community actually collaborate a fair bit, and with paleontology collaboration occurs as well.
Yeah, yeah, and a good testament to their authenticity also.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah. So we talked about meteorites, but do you have any quick thoughts to share about fossils? How do fossils contribute to scientific research in your point of view?
Yeah, well, the commercial fossil trade definitely contributes to the science of paleontology. One main way is that the profit incentive leads to very advanced fossil hunting and an efficient way of doing it. And then we're unearthing many more specimens that academics alone or even more casual collectors wouldn't have found. So, this targeted approach by serious commercial diggers leads to many more specimens being unearthed, including new species. And many commercial paleontologists actually will approach museums first when it's a very rare item like a new species. Some will only deal with the museum and academic community with certain types of rare finds. So new species wouldn't have been known about. These species wouldn't have been known about if it wasn't for the commercial fossil trade.
So this competition in the private space does end up helping excavation research. And I would love to head into a more personal question, if you don't
Sure.
mind. So I'd love to hear what are three simple recommendations you would give to your 25-year-old self when looking for investing in natural history specimens. I know you were investing already, but maybe something you didn't know back then.
Yeah, well, I would definitely advise my 25-year-old self to emphasize quality over quantity. I would really look at the displayability and visual appeal of an item is extremely important. And I would actually tell myself one really important thing: don't focus too much on rarity or a rare type. So we want to focus on exceptionality, but not necessarily rarity, because rarity is not always investable.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So visual appeal is more important at the end of the day than.
I wouldn't say more important, but I would say the combination of an item that's rare and visually appealing is what's important. So, for example, an item that's rare but uninteresting looking is not an investment specimen. An item that's visually appealing and rare is exactly what you're looking for.
And for a novice investor, what are two other recommendations that you would share?
I mean, I think it's really important to buy from a known dealer like Fossil Realm or to invest through a platform like Convi. And, I would say also remember that this is a passion too. So there's many options and many types of natural history specimens to invest in, to enjoy. So you can do it your own way as well.
Great. So let's imagine we are in 2030. How will the natural history specimen market look like compared to today, you think?
I actually think that in 2030, it'll be very different. Right now, the direction is more structure, more regulation, more informed buyers, more informed sellers, more sophisticated businesses and larger companies being involved. I think it'll actually be easier to trade items that are very well documented. So, for example, if there's more third party verification, it'll be likely easier to trade these items, which will increase their value.
Makes sense. We are seeing more and more regulation in the space. So I do hope it will happen because it will help experienced dealers like yourself.
Right. Like for example, when you buy a diamond and you have a GIA report, that's become fundamental to the diamond industry. There isn't an equivalent right now in the natural history industry,
Interesting.
but I would say there probably will be.
Yeah, it should be.
And I think I would prefer if there was one,
Hmm.
because more and more of our clients are demanding third party verification of sorts, and it's not really industry standard right now.
So, as we wrap up today's discussion, Peter, can you share the top three takeaways for the Convi community when it comes to fossil investments?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to put at number one, just enjoy what you're doing. These are some of the most exciting and interesting objects you'll ever come across. Two, I would say look for those really special pieces. That's what if you think it's a special piece, it probably is. So I do think there's an element of following your gut. But of course, you also need to be very informed. So understand the market to the extent that you can, understand what influences quality and desirability as well to the extent that you can, because you want to develop your own expertise.
Great, great. Thank you very much for all these tips. And I do think that we have learned quite a little bit about the space. It is a very opaque space at the moment. So we
Yeah.
really appreciate you walking through some of the insights within the industry that will also make maybe some of us more comfortable with fossil investments.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Peter, thank you very much. As a side note, don't forget to check our latest project with Fossil Realm. It's the Ammonite fossil that will soon be available on the Convi app. You can download the Convi app from the App Store, Play Store, and also visit us online via the web. And join us in our next podcast to discover exceptional investment opportunities in alternative investments. Peter, thank you very much. That was a great one.
Thanks so much. It was fun.